The title of the message this morning is called Imagine. And I'm going to be talking to you and sharing with you over the next many weeks, actually, out of the book of Joshua. Joshua is a fascinating Old Testament book, and I would hope that perhaps during your weekly study, if maybe you could just read a chapter of Joshua a week at a minimum. Because if you'll do, I think you'll find that the chapter that you've read is probably something that I'm going to be talking about the following Sunday. And so to start off this study of Joshua, I want to talk to you about imagining what it's like to be in Canaan's land. And what I've done is I've taken it from Joshua chapter 21, verses 43 through 45. So the Lord gave to Israel all the land of which he had sworn to give to their fathers. And they took possession of it and dwelt in it. The Lord gave them rest all around, according to all that he had sworn to their fathers. And not a man of all their enemies stood against them. The Lord delivered all their enemies into their hand. Not a word failed of any good thing which the Lord had spoken to the house of Israel. All came to pass. And the context of the story of Joshua is that for 7 years, the children of Israel were virtually untouchable. 7 nations had been conquered. At least 31 different kings had been defeated. Approximately 10,000 square miles of choice property had now been claimed by the Israelites. They had 7 years of absolute unbridled success. They were outnumbered, but they were never outpowered. They were under-equipped, but they were never overwhelmed. They were unlikely, but unquestionable conquerors of some of the most barbaric armies in the history of the world. Had the campaign been something like a prize fight, the referee probably would have called it in the first round. Not a TKO, but a knockout. The Hebrew people were unstoppable. The truth of the matter is they weren't always that way. The Bible, fortunately, doesn't gloss over some of the checkered history of God's chosen people, the Israelites. We know that in one situation, Abraham had too many wives. Jacob had told too many lies. Esau had sold his birthright. Joseph's brothers had sold Joseph. 4 centuries of Egyptian bondage were followed by 40 years of wilderness wandering. Then later, they were in Babylonian captivity for 70 years. The Hebrew people had built 2 temples, and they would lose them both. They were given the Ark of the Covenant, only to lose that too. Babylonia had built their cities, Greece had flexed their muscles, Rome was stretching its empire, and Israel, well, for a time, Israel was kind of like the schoolroom of an ancient nation where Israel is the kid with the black eye, all bullied and bloodied and in the back of the room. Except for those 7 years. Their accomplishments were so complete, the historian wrote what we have just read. But it's good to read it again, and you see it overhead. So the Lord gave to Israel all the land of which he had sworn to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it and dwelt in it. The Lord gave them rest all around, according to all that he had sworn to their fathers, and not a man of all their enemies stood against them. The Lord delivered all their enemies into their hands. Not a word failed of any good thing which the Lord had spoken to the house of Israel, all came to pass. And I think those are some pretty sweeping statements, don't you? For instance, the Lord gave all the land, or the Lord gave them rest. Maybe not a man of all of their enemies stood against them. The most staggering one is all came to pass. Winter chill had given way to springtime for the Israelites, and a new season had been born in their life. And maybe you could use a new season too. You don't need necessarily to cross the Jordan River, but you just need to get through the week. You aren't facing a Jericho, but maybe you're facing rejection or heartache. Canaanites aren't stalking you like they were the Israelites, but maybe disease or discouragement and danger, maybe they do. And you wonder if you have what it takes to face tomorrow. Because sometimes the challenges just seem too big and too much. I mean, you want to keep up. I want to keep up. You try. I try. And it's not that we're not trying, and it's not that we don't want to try and keep up. It's just sometimes you run out of fight. Life has a way of sometimes just taking the life out of us, don't you think? And the book of Joshua, I think, is in the Bible for just those seasons. It dares you and I to believe that our best days are ahead of us. You see, the Promised Land was the third stop on the Hebrews' iconic itinerary. Their pilgrimage began in Egypt, it continued through the wilderness, and then it concluded in Canaan. And each land represents almost a different condition in life if you read it broadly. It's kind of like geography as theology. In Egypt, the Hebrews were enslaved to Pharaoh. In the wilderness, they were free from Pharaoh, but they were still enslaved to their fear. They refused to enter the Promised Land, and they languished in the desert. And only in Canaan did they discover victory. And I think to an extent, most of us have traveled that same itinerary. Egypt represents our days before we were saved. We were in bondage to sin. We wore the leg irons of guilt and death. But then came our deliverer, Jesus Christ. And by his grace and in his power, we crossed the Red Sea. He liberated us from the old life and offered us a brand new life in Canaan. Now, our promised land isn't a physical territory. It is a spiritual reality. It's not real estate, but it is a real state of both our heart and our mind. A promised land life in which, for instance, in Romans chapter 8, verse 37, Paul says, we are more than conquerors through Christ who loved us. A life in which we do not lose heart. And that's Paul encouraging the church in Corinth in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16. A life in which Christ's love has the first and the last word in everything we do. That same 2 Corinthians book, chapter 5, verse 14. A life in which we are exceedingly joyful in all of our tribulations. Again, Paul encouraging the Corinthian church, 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 4. A life in which we are anxious for nothing. Paul encouraging the Philippian church, Philippians chapter 4, verse 6, in which we are praying always. Paul encouraging the Ephesians church in chapter 6, verse 18. Paul is writing about a life in which we do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Colossians chapter 3, verse 17. Isn't it interesting that Paul spends so much of his time writing and encouraging churches who were struggling to see the reality of the Canaan that God has provided them? Canaan is a life that is defined by grace, and it is refined then by challenges, and then it is aligned with this heavenly call. You see, in God's plan, and more importantly, in God's land, this land of Canaan, we win more often than we lose. We forgive as quickly as we're offended. And we give as abundantly as we receive. We serve out of our giftedness. We all have talents in various areas. And we delight in whatever assignment the Lord has provided us. We may stumble, but we don't collapse. We may struggle, but we don't despair. We boast only in Christ, trust only in God, and lean wholly on his power. We enjoy the abundant fruit and increasing faith. Canaan symbolizes the victory that we can have today. Now, I know we sang a song, "To Canaan's land I'm on my way," but Joshua encourages us that the Canaan that God has provided for each of us is something that we can have presently, not tomorrow or not when we're deceased. Heaven will have no enemies. Now, Canaan had at least 7 enemy nations. And heaven's not going to have any battles, but Joshua and his men fought at least 31 separate wars. Joshua chapter 12, verses 9 through 24. Heaven will be free of stumbles and struggles. Joshua's men stumbled and struggled. But their victories far outnumbered their defeats. Canaan, then, doesn't represent the life to come. Canaan represents the life that we can have now. And God invites us to enter into Canaan. There is one condition, however, and that condition is we need and must turn our backs on the wilderness. You see, just as Canaan represents the victorious Christian life, the wilderness represents the defeated Christian life. You see, in the desert, the Hebrew people were liberated from their Egyptian bondage, right? But you wouldn't have known it if you'd listened to them. And here's why I say that. Just 3 days after they have been liberated from Egyptian bondage, listen to the children of Israel talk. 3 days into their freedom, this is Exodus chapter 15, verse 24. The people complained against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" A few more days passed, and the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. "Oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt. For you have brought us into this wilderness to kill this entire assembly with hunger." That's Exodus chapter 16, verses 2 and 3. Skip a little further ahead. The people contended with Moses. Do you know what it means to contend with somebody? They wanted to kick him out. They wanted to toss him. They wanted another leader. They wanted somebody different. They didn't like the leadership that they were receiving from Moses. And that's just one chapter later, in chapter 17, verse 2. And then, the next verse, it says, the people complained against Moses. I mean, they inhaled anxiety like we inhale oxygen. They bellyached to the point, one verse later, that here's Moses' prayer. What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me. How could the Hebrew people go from carefree to the Dead Sea? I mean, how does that happen? I mean, in our Bible, it's a matter of a couple chapters, and in some cases, it's just a couple of verses. How do you sing happiness leaving Egypt, and a while later, you want to kill your leader? It wasn't due to any lack of miracles. I mean, the Hebrew people had seen God's power in high def. I mean, they watched locusts gobble up crops. They saw boils devour people's skin. They saw flies buzzing through Pharaoh's court. I mean, God turned the chest-thumping Egyptians literally into shark bait right before the Hebrews' eyes. But when God called them to cross over into Canaan, the 12 spies, if you remember, returned, and all but 2 said that that was mission impossible. The giants were too big for them. In fact, in Numbers chapter 13, verse 33, it says, we were like grasshoppers, midgets compared to these giants. So, God gave them time to think it over. And basically what he did is he put the entire nation in a timeout for 40 years. And what did they do during that 40 years? They walked in circles. They ate the same food every day. Life was this endless routine of the same rocks and the same lizards and the same snakes. Victories were very scarce. Progress was extremely slow. They were saved, right? They were saved from the Egyptians, but they weren't strong. They were redeemed, but they still weren't released. They were saved from Pharaoh, but stuck in the desert. They were redeemed, but locked into a routine. Monotonous, dull, ho-hum, humdrum. 4 decades of tedium. In fact, the reason why they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years was to kill off the entire generation of Hebrews who said it couldn't be done. Only Joshua and Moses were saved. 4 decades of tediousness. Does that sound at all familiar to you? I mean, it sounds miserable to me. But how many of us as Christians, for whatever reason, find ourselves walking in circles, doing the same thing over and over again? We've been saved, but you wouldn't know it. You couldn't tell from our face. You couldn't see it from our behavior. We're free, but we act like we're in bondage. And the reason why I know that is I found this very interesting study. It's by a group called Reveal, R-E-V-E-A-L. And it was a research project that they conducted back in 2007, so this was a decade ago, but they were trying to find real-life Joshuas, people in a church community that had a vision and wanted to get to Canaan. They began surveying members of more than 1,000 different churches. They wanted to determine the percentage of churchgoers who were actually propelled by their faith to love God and love others with their entire hearts. And what they did is they asked how many of these people that they interviewed would describe their days as Christians as being their best days. You know what the answer was? 11%. That's nearly 9 out of 10 believers languishing in the wilderness. Are they saved? Well, yeah. But are they empowered? No. Because they are wasting away in the worst of ways. They are in the land of in-between. Saved, but not yet in the promised land. Out of Egypt, but not yet in Canaan. I mean, what if a high school only graduated 11% of its students? What if a hospital only saved 11% of their patients? What if a baseball team only won 11% of their games? But they're better than that, Steve. They won more than 11%. In fact, they beat the Giants this year, so they're not exactly the cellar dwellers. But you know, if 11% of the people coming out of a hospital are saved, and the rest languish or die, or if we're only graduating 11% of our high school seniors, or a baseball team or a football team is only winning 11% of its games, wouldn't it be time for a change? I mean, wouldn't you get a different coach, a different principal, a different hospital administrator, a different doctor? Well, I think so. But if Christians, only 11% of them, are finding their best days today, don't you think a change might be necessary? Might be something good to investigate? I mean, do you sense sometimes this disconnect between God's promises here and the reality of your life here? Jesus offers us abundant joy, yet we end up living with this oppressive grief. I mean, the epistles speak of grace, and yet we shoulder this immense. Paul says we are more than conquerors in Romans chapter 8, verse 37. And yet we are completely conquered by temptations or weaknesses. So many of us, church, are caught in this land between Egypt and Canaan. I want you today to think about the Christian you want to be. What qualities do you want to have as a Christian? More compassion? More conviction? More courage, maybe? And what attitudes do you want to discontinue? Maybe you're a little too greedy, a little too guilty, or maybe you're just endlessly negative. Here's the good news, church. You can change. With God's help, you can close that gap between the person that you are and the person you want to be, and the person God made you to be. And you can be that person that Paul was talking about in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18, that you, church, can live from glory to glory. You see, church, the walls of Jericho in your life, they've already been condemned. The giants in your life are already on the run. The deed to your new life in Canaan has already been given to you because it was paid for by Jesus Christ. It just falls on you to possess what you've been given. Joshua and his men did it. They went from dry land to promised land. They went from manna to feasts. They went from arid desert to fertile fields. They inherited their inheritance. So I want you this week, if you would please, go back to Joshua chapter 21, and I want you to put your name in the blanks. Elliot, I'm going to give you a challenge here. This isn't what I thought about, but keep you on your toes. Can you go back to slide number 2, which is the... Perfect, that one. No, go past this. That's one. Okay. Do you see this, church? Do you see where the word Israel is? I want you to substitute your name in that place. And as you read this scripture this week, I would challenge you and encourage you to read it as follows. So the Lord gave Randy all the land he had sworn to give him. And Randy took possession of it and settled there. The Lord gave Randy rest on every side, just as he had sworn to Randy. Not one of Randy's enemies withstood him. The Lord handed all of Randy's enemies over to him. Not one of all the Lord's good promises to Randy failed. Every one was fulfilled. And church, if you can read that passage and put your name in that space, you can then understand that the Canaan that God has promised you is not some faraway Beulah land. That is included. But it is a life that can be joyful and happy today. A life that can start taking God's promises and acting on them now. Not some distant future, but today. Okay. Thanks, Elliot. Now, can you go back to the last slide? Thank you. Church, I want you to imagine. I know, who is it? John Lennon made a song popular, Imagine. Did you know that John Lennon was just singing a cover of a Jesus song? Because Jesus told you to do the same. He said to imagine. Imagine a life that is full throttle. Imagine a you as you were intended to be. Imagine you as a victor over your Jerichos and your giants. Because it's yours for the taking. Expect to be challenged, of course. The enemy was not going to go down without a fight, without a doubt. But expect progress. Life is different on the west side of the Jordan. Your breakthroughs are going to outnumber your breakdowns. God's promises are going to outweigh your personal problems. Victory becomes, if you can imagine, a way of life. And so, church, my question of you and of me is, isn't it time to change your mailing address from the wilderness to the promised land? because your inheritance awaits you. And just as Joshua commanded his troops, let's get marching. Too many times, personally, I go through my own Christian walk, and the people with whom I come into contact, they would not know me as a Christian from the man on the moon, because I might have the same bad attitude as the people that I'm around. And I hang around lawyers and judges and juries, and it seems like they all have bad attitudes. And if there's not something different about my life, what's going to make me distinct from any of those people that I run around with? Nothing. But if I live my life taking hold of the promise of the present Canaan that I can have today, then that is an exciting life, right? A life where other people are like saying, wow, you've got something going. I mean, you're a decent lawyer, but there's just something about you, Randy. I mean, things don't really upset you that much. I mean, you seem to be engaged in a conversation. You seem to smile more often than you frown. You don't seem to panic. And that provides me then with the best possible opportunity to share with people who I am. I'm not some sort of Superman. I'm not some sort of saint that levitates as we leave the building today. I'm just like them, but I worship a God who loves me so much that he gave me his Son, Jesus Christ, as the propitiation for my sins so that I could be with him one day. And in that context, if I live a life knowing where I'm going, then it allows me to be happy where I am today. So church, that's my encouragement to you this week. Read Joshua 21 and put your name in the blank and see if you don't start acting and behaving differently because you've grasped hold of God's promise for you today. It is so important. And it's something that you can do, but you've got to be intentional about it. Walk through life intentionally, trusting your life to God, praising him for his blessings, noticing things where people could use help or assistance, and then being that hand, being that leg, being that eye, being that mouth, being that advocate, so that God can, through you, reach people who are living a life of nothing but failures and hopelessness. You have something to share with them that's vitally important. And if you will seize the moment of your own blessings today, then you will be the person that can be of encouragement to that person that you see in the grocery store or at the office or perhaps, I don't know, the gas station or the park somewhere else. So we've selected this next song. Can you advance it? To Canaan's land, I'm on my way. And that is true. We are on our way to Canaan's land from the eternity perspective. But we can be in Canaan's land today if we will just take hold of the promises that God has given to us. So let's stand and let's sing, please.